Hi, I'm Scott McDaniel here at Simple Helix, and I have our IT director, Brad Burns, here with me. One of the popular questions that we got asked during our live event was around setting the boundaries and setting scope. And as we talked with folks in the audience, we realized a lot of folks were getting it wrong, specifically trying to include everything within their IT environment, saying, hey, everything has to go into it. Setting boundaries and setting the scope of your compliance role is actually really important.
So setting a scope and setting a boundary is really the foundation of a successful CMMC program. What you have to understand is the data that you hold. You have to understand where you store that data. You have to understand the systems that transmit, the systems that process that data, and you have to really keep track of that data. This is the foundation of compliance, right? Is keeping track of that data in a way that it can always be accounted for and always be protected. Setting your scope really defines how you build your SSP. It defines how you build your networks. It defines how you build really all of the services that your business is using to accomplish your business tasks.
That's right. And so with that, not everything that your business is going to do is considered in scope, right? Mm-hmm. What we're targeting is things that are labeled classified or unclassified controlled information, or that FCI, the contract information. But a lot of people don't realize is that, if you were developing a software application, if you're developing that in-house, that's your IP. That's not considered CUI yet, right? So that can be out of scope all the way up until the point where you're actually using some sort of data from a federal agency or government directly. So those are the things that then make it in scope. So one of our customers recently went through a JSVA, Joint Surveillance Voluntary Audit, and things that we sort of saw them go through was their accounting system got tried to get lumped into scope. Well, their accounting system doesn't have any CUI in it. It's out of scope. And so we had to fight with the auditors to say, no, Uninet is not in scope for this. There's no CUI being pushed into Uninet. It's out of scope. And I think a lot of people miss that, hey, there's definitely defined things there. So with that, another popular thing that we're starting to see more and more customers ask about are enclaves.
Enclaves build on that scoping and setting your boundary. An enclave is basically where you want to store your CUI, where you want to store your protected data. And the enclave gives you that opportunity to maximize the security, the policy settings, everything else to make sure that you are protecting that set of data. But the reason that you enclave that data into a specific spot is to do exactly what you're talking about, which is, hey, I've got my data sit over here in this enclave. This is where it is. These are the controls on my enclave, but I may have my marketing department who's doing my advertising, my slick sheets and all of that other good stuff. They don't ever touch CUI. So I have my enclave over here, and then I have my marketing department over here where I can say, hey, marketing department, you can run your Mac OS, you can run your Adobe products, you can run everything else. You won't ever be storing our CUI. You won't ever be processing it. So I'm going to make sure you're secure, but I'm going to write you out of my boundary.
A great example where we've done this in the past is a commercial company, 100 employees, but they get their first government contract. So now there's a subset of maybe about 5 or 10 employees that are going to be working on that contract. Well, we don't want to take all 100 people over and make them all be compliant because that incurs a lot of costs. The Microsoft 365 licenses to go get everybody compliant is a more expensive license. And so if I can go build that enclave for those 5 or 10 people, yes, those 5 or 10 people do incur the higher cost, but that's a whole lot cheaper than doing it for 100 employees.
It maximizes the value of what you're spending in order to get compliant. That's always a win-win for everybody when you're doing that.
The other part too is we can do that a whole lot faster. Because if you can imagine, hey, if I only have to move 5 or 10 people into the special space, as opposed to moving 100 people, trying to change culture, trying to make sure that everybody's email and contacts and gets into the right place. If we're only doing that for a subset of people, we can do that whole thing very quickly. And, even to, migration and implementation, those type of things, we don't have to make as many decisions. We just go, hey, look, this is how it's going to be for these 5 or 10 people. We implement, we go, we can get that fast track better than trying to do the whole org.
That doesn't even go to speak to any auditing headaches that you may see when your auditors show up. If you have your boundary scoped correctly, and you go and deploy an enclave, make sure you have secure access, controlled access to that enclave, your auditor is probably going to thank you at the end of the day. And who doesn't want that?
Exactly.
Getting Macs through a CMMC audit. I guess the first question you kind of have to ask yourself is, can Macs be compliant? The answer to that is yes, they can be compliant. There's no magic sauce that they can't go partake of to be compliant. The real question that you have to ask yourself is, what is the cost to getting the macOS device into compliance? And not only is that cost in terms of what you may be paying to get it compliant, but that's cost your organization too, as far as how much time do you want to spend into a compliant scenario. You have to really ask yourself, why is my organization using Macs? Like, what are the macOS devices doing maybe better than the Windows devices? You have to ask yourself questions like, do I want to go into an all Mac environment? Am I in a hybrid environment? And one of the big questions is how many Macs do I even have? If you have 2 or 3 Macs in an environment of 5 people, a small business, hey, that's a lot easier than 50 Macs in the midst of 150 Windows machines.
Exactly. And then, we'll hear a lot of people say, well, the Mac can't be done. And we know the Macs can be done. It's just that there is a much easier path to compliance if you're all Windows.
There's an easy button if you are part of the Windows ecosystem, for sure.
Exactly. And then, that all starts with getting the right Microsoft 365 environment. So getting in the 365 GCC or GCC High. And then from there, since it is a Microsoft world, if you have Microsoft laptops and PCs, they will natively join into the 365 environment. We can snap those into compliance. Mac does it differently. So we're kind of some of the different tool sets when you can't. What can 365 do? And then what are some of the tool sets you have to go get in addition to if you're going to do the Mac?
So the Mac OS, it can be adopted into the M365 ecosystem to an extent. The Intra tool will adopt it, will apply some set of policies to the device. Real-world testing, to be upfront with everybody, the real-world testing, there's a little bit of lack of stability in that. So you may set a policy in your Intra, and it may be a while before you see that on a Mac OS device. The feature set that you get on Windows management, the ability to push policies and control password complexity, for instance, it exists in Intune for the most part, but there are some noticeable features missing from that world. But tools that you can kind of think of to go and put a Mac into a compliance or work yourself closer to having that ecosystem of compliance around a Mac OS. There are tools like Jump Cloud that can help with local MacBook authentication.
Getting the multi-factor authentication and everything to sync properly.
Yeah, exactly. Where, your Windows world, you've got the Azure Active Directory system that manages your identity across your devices, across your email, across all of your domain. The Mac OS, you will need to go and adopt some sort of tool like a Jump Cloud tool to do such. The other piece of that is kind of filling those gaps with controlling the Mac. In CMMC and NIST, there are a lot of requirements around things that you have to control on the device in order for that device to be able to store, process CUI data.
Sure.
So in the Mac world, like I said, there are some notable features missing from Intra, but you can go adopt other tool sets like Jamf. That's solid go-to for anybody running Mac, anybody wanting to push policy to Mac is Jamf. There are several other tools. Hexcode, Kanji is also another tool that does configuration management for Mac OS. If you're living in a Windows environment, I think that's probably the biggest challenge with it. If you have a full-blown Mac OS environment, you go and adopt the correct tools, you push the policy, you go jump cloud, Jamf, you got it. But when you're looking at your environment from you have Windows and you have Mac coexisting on the same network, then you start having questions of, well, I may have to adopt two ecosystems.
And that kind of goes back to where we started. Again, if you're a 100%
Yeah,
company
exactly.
and there's 5 Macs, are you going to go stand up all this extra infrastructure for 5 Macs, or do you just say, hey, look, sorry, let's just keep it all Windows homogeneous environment, and that way, you just click off the boxes. You're not having to keep up with one set of tools for Mac, another set of tools for Windows. Go about that route. Reflecting back on our previous topic, another thing that we have seen is if the customer does enclave and they want to use that Mac, then inside that enclave use that virtual Windows desktop and say, okay, well, I get it. You're going to carry your Mac around with you. That's what you're going to use on a day-to-day basis. When you're processing CUI, hey, you're going to connect, and you're going to have to use a Windows desktop for this piece of the job, and hey, that's just the way it is because that's what it takes to get it compliant. But hey, because I would say, in my experience, one of the big reasons why we like the Macs is because they're easy to use. They are stable. The lid opens, and when you open the lid, it just turns on. It's not booting up and all those things. There's a lot of convenience that comes with that.
Absolutely.
And compliance and convenience do not go together. those are two opposing forces.
They're scoped very differently, right?
and so I can see where, it would be nice. Hey, I can keep my convenience. When it's time to not have to be convenient, hey, I connect to that remote desktop. All right, so likewise, the next one that comes up is Linux. How do we get Linux to be compliant?
So Linux is probably the hardest topic to cover when it comes to compliance. And of course, we're talking about mostly Linux when it comes to Linux on a workstation. Linux running on a workstation, there's a great feature of one of the later Ubuntu releases that allows you to natively go and connect it to Azure Active Directory. Linux actually may have, at least the Ubuntu release, may have a little bit of a leg up on the Mac OS environment because you can go and attach it natively to your Azure AD environment. Outside of that, policy management for Linux, you have several vendors. You have Red Hat, you have Ubuntu with Ubuntu Pro release that they are starting to bring on board those native tool sets to go and be able to push policy to those end user workstations and things like that. I think you have to ask yourself the same question, though, that you did with Mac OS of why are my users running Linux in the environment on a workstation? And oftentimes, your users are going to be running Linux for the flexibility that's inherent to Linux. And so I think this is a part where you have to kind of tread carefully in your environment because we don't want to go and hinder these people from going and building your product, building your tool sets by going and deploying policy that hinder that flexibility. But the fact is there are several tools that are there to go do it. But I think we kind of go back to the scoping conversation of, are these devices processing our CUI? And if they're not, to your point, we may scope these out of the compliance boundary or moving those users to using their Linux device day to day and then leveraging that secure enclave in order to process CUI.
One of my first compliance customers, they got a Cyber to go do some machine learning. They wanted to do it on a Linux box, and then the whole idea around it was that they were going to process images that ultimately had Russian trucks with big missile on the top, and they had to identify where the truck was in the picture and all that stuff. But when they were in their early learning phases of that, they were just trying to figure out how to use AI, right? They're in that initial dev learning curve portion of it. And so they're just using a folder filled with cat pictures. Right. So it's cat pictures. It's, we're leveraging the Linux environment for open source and the freedom to get all these cool tools and the tensor from Google and all those type of things. And so we still, though, had, these two engineers that were working on it. the whole rest of the company is not in scope.
Right.
And so there was a point where we're like, okay, well, we're just going to take this high-end, workstation. We shoved it into an office. We added a second set of door locks on it. We buried it, where it was 2 layers deep inside the office. It was put behind a second firewall. It in itself had protection around the Linux box, even though we couldn't back then. There wasn't the Ubuntu distributions like we have today. So, it was just a copy of just generic Ubuntu on it. But we put enough wrapping protection around it, kind of wrapped it with the bubble wrap, so to speak, and said, okay, you can't remotely log into it. You're not VPNing from home to get into it.
Right.
If you need to process these, missile pictures, you're going to sit in this space behind these locked doors and you work on it. And to that point, that was how we were able to help keep the control on that CUI.
Yeah, so the physical manifestation of compartmentalizing and scoping.
Exactly.
So I think from that, the top tip from there is from Simple Helix, lock your Linux people in a closet if you want to be compliant.
We could go put them in like an Azure Gov cloud environment and stuff like that.
Much better solution.
Right, to go wrap that, go make sure, again, we're putting that proverbial bubble wrap around it. At the end of the day, auditors are auditors. They're not, they're not technicians. They're not, they're not software developers. They're not engineers. They're auditors.
Right.
And, trying to explain a compliance model in an environment that is not as popular as a Windows environment is going to be a challenging thing to do when it gets to audit, right? Because they're just not going to be familiar with the technology. So we do see where, customers want to hit that proverbial easy button. And when you say, hey, I am running this in Microsoft, it's 365 GCC, and the laptops are running Windows, auditors start going, oh, I get this. I've seen this before a million times. You need to start throwing either the Mac or the Linux in. They kind of go, ooh, I haven't seen this before. It's a little bit more challenging, but to the point, it can be done. You just got to be ready to put more time and energy into it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think those are really the 2 important topics of this, right? Are one, can be done. It absolutely can be done on Mac OS, Linux, Windows, whatever. But it comes down to the amount of time that you're willing to go and invest, the amount of money that you're willing to go and invest in this process, then how you are going to scope your environment and write your boundaries around everything. Those are really the 2 key points of going from, hey, I've got a Mac OS, I've got Linux, I've got Windows on my environment, and we need to be CMMC, to being CMMC compliant.
All right. Yeah. Which phone? Android or Apple?
Yeah. So I don't know that either one of them necessarily are easier or not. I think there are requirements around the Apple phone that you just need to be aware of before you go and try to bring that into your compliant environment. Apple iPhones, they need to make this as easy as possible, to make a very smooth transition. Having all of your iDevices registered in Apple's Business Manager will allow you to connect that up to an intra environment, and you're able to go and kind of bring that inventory directly into your intra environment. And once it's in the intra, you can start pushing out policies to manage it. The Android phones, they don't have necessarily a parent control mechanism by default. So those guys, they adopt right into the intra environment by the individual phones. So which is easier? It kind of depends on kind of where your mindset is at. Do you like kind of having that individual control of, hey, I want to take this Android phone, I want to adopt it to my environment, then I want to take the next one and adopt it? Or do you want to go and kind of adopt the Apple ecosystem, including Business Manager, so that you can kind of adopt everything all in at once?
Another question I get asked all the time is, all right, well, I have my personal iPhone, but I want to check work email on it. Ultimately, what does that experience look like?
At a high level, you can bring that in as a non-company owned device into your intra portal. Effectively, I guess kind of the metaphor is when you adopt that, it creates a sandbox on your personal environment and that's where your all of your corporate email, that's where all of your corporate applications will run, store their data, etc. And then if you ever lose the device, if you leave the company, whatever it is, as that device is retired, onboarded, I guess is the word, it will go and retroactively remove all of that data so that you kind of go on your merry way.
Right. One of the ways that I typically describe it is, I have customers and they'll ask, well, I want my work email integrated in with the native mail app on the phone so I can see my home email, my work email. Yeah, that's not happening.
No.
That won't work.
Yeah.
It's if you are in that Microsoft environment, you're going to use the Microsoft Outlook app to check your work email.
Absolutely.
And the reason that works like that is to that point, that sandbox that, hey, if you leave that organization, hey, now you're going to uninstall the Outlook app, which means all the work data leaves with it. But you don't have to, reformat your phone. You don't lose your personal pictures or your personal contacts and all that stuff. It is kind of bundled up in the app.
Exactly. So. Yeah, exactly. It just puts that boundary in between your personal life and the protected workspace that you have.
When it comes to, hey, where do we even start the CMMC compliance journey and our compute environment? For us at Simple Helix, we always start this conversation out, hey, which Microsoft 365 environment you need to be in, because we can go and touch so many of the CMMC controls. There is no silver bullet for the whole thing, but the 365 definitely puts a lot of the controls, within a controllable environment, something that we can control. And so there really is a good conversation that has to happen with the customer about, are we going, well, at the end of the day, in the 365 world, that's going to be either GCC or GCC High. Within the Microsoft ecosystem, there are 5 versions of 365. Very few people understand that there's actually 5 versions of 365. The ones that we're mostly interested in is the commercial environment, which is where most businesses are, and they'll have what they call the business standard, that business premium type license. The next step up is the GCC environment, government cloud community. Then the next step above that is going to be the GCC High. The high in the name stands for FedRAMP High Certified Environment. And then the last one's government. And government is for, the military and, the DoD, government agencies. They all live in government. So we do always have this conversation around, okay, well, we know commercial is not going to be compliant. So we at least got to get you to GCC or GCC High. That turns into a conversation about, well, is your business 90% commercial and 10% government? If it's that way, we're probably going to go GCC because the pricing between commercial and GCC is basically the same. There's little bit differences, but not substantial price differences and matching licenses between the two.
Compared to the value that you get, it's negligible for price difference.
Exactly. If you are a contractor that talking to a federal agency every single day, the majority of the employees are interacting with military .mil addresses every day. It's 90% weighted that way. Well, we can go get you closer to that government environment with GCC High. The other big needle pusher for GCC High is if you get into a contract that has an itar requirement. That itar is the only environment that you can get in that will support the itar truly is that GCC High environment. And the reason that this decision is so important is that when you go GCC High, the pricing for everything basically doubles. And so, we are trying to actively say, hey, we don't want you to have to pay double if you don't need to. But, we absolutely have had customers that, hey, I interact with, this agency every single day. I am butted right up against them. This is what I do. I need to be GCC High because that's how I want my teams to easily chat, my emails easily flow. I need to incur that expense to have that convenience. Or I have to have it for that itar requirement. But outside of that, if we are trying to do the NIST 800-171, if we're trying to do CMMC, kind of the center of the bell curve there is going to be the GCC environment.
One of the ways that we do control costs or help control costs too, as we were talking to customers, if they do have that itar requirement, or if they are interacting with the dot mills on a daily basis, we'll go back to their scoping efforts and understand, hey, are 10 of your 100 employees interacting with itar on the day-to-day basis? If that's the case, then there are solutions where you can have your majority of people on your GCC environment, be cost effective that way, and then create a GCC high environment and then enclave those 10 people into that GCC high environment. So you get the best of both worlds. You protect your people that are dealing with itar on a day-to-day basis while saving the money and really gaining value from going GCC for the main part of your business.
So once again, got to start with the scope, got to figure out what we're going to enclave or not enclave, which then leads to your 365. And then, but then once we make that determination, hey, the bulk of the organization needs to be GCC, what are some of the other tools that then we layer in to help manage desktops, laptops, and things like that, in addition to the 365?
So the big tool that we bring to the table with our managed service subscription is we use something called Endpoint Central. It's a tool that installs an agent on each of the workstations, and that tool is able to provide us with the ability to remote manage the workstation, but we're also able to apply policies such as patch schedules, which are hugely important for the CMMC world. We're able to apply specific policies. So the one that comes to mind is there are requirements around the use of portable media. One of the policies that we roll out via our endpoint manager is controls on what machines can mount a USB drive, even down to the point of what serial number of the USB drive can they mount, so that you can effectively build a whitelist of portable media that you have in your company. That's really the main tool that we use day to day to manage, because it works really well in concert with the Intra platform on the Windows environments, where it complements the capability set so that we have a full catalog, I suppose you could say, of control across the machines.
Right. And then along with that, we also gain asset management or asset inventory.
Absolutely.
That's another checkbox for the compliance. And then another thing that we see often is, especially in smaller organizations, they're accustomed to having that administrator access on their own personal device. They can come and install software whenever they want.
Exactly.
That's total opposite to the compliance model. But our endpoint manager, it does give them a self-service portal so that they can install applications that are allowed to be installed.
Right.
So it is a happy medium there between, hey, somebody has to validate what software applications get installed on a desktop or laptop. That can be done through the endpoint manager. It gets published into the self-service portal. Now the employee doesn't necessarily feel that, all of their hands have been handcuffed, that they can still go in and still go, I'm on the road and I forgot to install this Adobe software or whatever it is. At least, hey, now I can still get it and, self-serve on that one.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when does CMMC become a reality? So CMMC has definitely had its challenges along the way. We at Simple Helix, we've been tracking it since version 0.4. CMMC version 1 went live basically in, I'll say, February of 2020. And then version 1 had its challenges, a lot of pushback, things like that. Come 2021, CMMC version 2 gets born. So now we've been anticipating version 2 to become the law. So where are we in that journey? So for that, we waited for a long time for OIRA to do their what they call the rulemaking process. They were supposed to do that in 60 days. It took them 150 days. But that finally moved right there basically at Thanksgiving time frame for final proposed rule to get published in the Federal Register in December. That then went to open public feedback for 60 business days. Those 60 business days just lapsed here in March of 2024. And now it moves on to where it now becomes a law, which means it's got to go in front of Congress. We have to factor in the sense that this is an election year. The timeline as it stands as of April of 2024 is that we're really looking for it to become law in March of 2025. That is where we're at on the timeline. When will it actually be fully implemented in contracts? So for the longest time, we have seen, hey, it's all going to be 2026. It's going to be 2026. Here recently, that goalpost finally has moved to 2028.
Yeah.
So there is at least some sense that, hey, the final goalpost did get moved. For a long time, we've been, hey, in 2020, it was going to be 2026 as the end game, and then 2021 comes by. But and so that just keeps, your time to implement just shrinks every day. And then, you're sitting there going, okay, well, you guys are going to make this a final law in March of 2025, but you're supposed to go live 2026 with this. There's no way that 600 companies in the defense industrial base are going to implement and get through audit in a year or 6 months. So it is nice that needle finally got moved out to 2028.
Yes.
With that, there is a lot of work that goes into this. It does take a long time to do it. We already know that CMMC version 2 Level 2 is basically NIST 800-171. We've been supposed to have been doing NIST 800-171 since 2017. Any energy that we put towards wrapping up all the controls for NIST 800-171 is not wasted. And so there is, hey, you got to start, because you don't know what's going to happen in your business that's going to distract you from getting this compliance thing done. There's a lot of parts that have to change. There's culture that changes. There's training that has to get done. There's so much to get done. You don't want to wait until it becomes the final law to say, hey, now I'm finally going to start doing it. There's a lot of knowledge and information and things that you can work through ahead of time where you won't be wasting your time or money doing it. So you definitely want to get started on the journey sooner than later.
Yeah, absolutely. Now is definitely the time that you want to be planning. We can't underscore enough how much easier, how much smoother the process goes when we're working with clients who have taken the time and invested that time in planning their journey. So building their SSP, thinking about what they do, scoping and setting their boundaries, and really building a plan for their business and what their business does to gain the compliance, rather than just seeing this as we just have to go do this. We're just going to go and bolt it all on top of what we do. Because that planning will lead to a solid scope, solid boundary, and then a solid step-by-step implementation. And you said something that really struck me there, where you were talking about culture. Because the big reason why you can't just go and take these rules and slap them on top of your devices and your employees is because this has to be a culture change. Everyone has to understand why this is happening. Everybody has to understand the value of what's happening here. And with that culture, when the audit time comes, auditor doesn't just go and find one person to go and pick on. They have pretty much a wide range of scope within your organization when they come to audit you. So what will happen is they will interview your IT guy, they'll interview the CEO, they'll interview Stacy in accounting, they'll interview really anybody that they can pull into a room to talk to. And what they will be doing is ensuring that what you're telling them, what you're showing them, isn't just this lip service, just isn't documentation that lives in the ether, but it's really implemented, for one, but that it's ingrained in the culture so that they know at the end of the day that the technological pieces, and your culture are harmonized on protecting this data and working together. And then everybody has to be invested in making it successful so that your company will be able to go and achieve this goal to achieve their business ends.
Yeah, I can actually give a real example. So our customer that went through JSVA, small business, there's only one printer in the entire company, and that's with their accountant, their accounting manager. And as demonstrated, we kept talking about how they kept trying to pull Uninet back into scope. I don't know, Uninet needs to be scope because it's cloud service. No, we don't put any CUI in there, right? Well, then they go and, to your point, they go do this tour around the office. They see that the printer is in this lady's office, and they go and they start quizzing her. And go, well, what do you print on the printer? She goes, well, I print, some invoices and, whatnot, but, that's about the extent of it. And she had to been trained to say, when they started quizzing, well, do you print CUI on there? Well, she had been trained. She goes, no, I don't print CUI out of this printer. Well, why don't you print any CUI? Well, because it's against corporate policy. And then she didn't know the exact policy, but she said, but I know I can go to this thing called an SSP. I know I can go look for it, and I'll go find you the policy if you want me to go find the policy. Absolutely the most brilliant answer.
Absolutely.
Right? But if she hadn't been trained, if she didn't understand the why of why the auditors are walking around, and again, it takes time to do all, get everybody teed up. Another common one that auditors like to ding folks on is they'll sit and they'll wait for an employee to get up from their desk, and they leave their laptop or desktop unlocked.
Just unlocked, yep.
And so, and I had to live through that world in my past, and, I very quickly got used to hitting the Windows L all the time before I get up, and they'll sit there and wait for somebody to get up, and then be like, "Oh, I caught you, right? I caught you. You need to lock your laptop." And then then you got to go explain, "Hey, but there's a policy behind this that's going to lock their screen in 30 seconds or whatever that time is." It takes time to get everybody on board with it. In this particular case with this company, before they even signed the formation of the company, signed up for made their LLC, the CEO of the company was like, this will be my culture day one. We're going to be a compliant driven business. If you haven't had that, or you're a business that's been in service for 20, 30 years, you have a culture, and it's hard to move the needle on a 20 or 30-year-old culture to go, hey, you got to do all this new compliance stuff.
So, kind of building off of that point, it is something that's hard to kind of get your head around, that, you invest all this money, you invest all this time into a technological solution for your business to become compliant. And, if you miss the culture step, that, our Stacy from accounting, right? Yeah. If she doesn't understand why she, has these controls on her desktop or can't print to that printer, that's going to be a ding, and that could be a serious audit fail.
Yeah, going back to my example, if that accountant had not known the rules, or she, she was just not paying attention to, I don't know. Yeah, that would have been an immediate failure right there. And again, that's how audit works, right? You say what you do, and then you got to prove that you do what you say. Well, if you say that I've trained everybody this, hey, this is how we control our CUI, and they go to see if everybody knows how to do that, and they go, how do you control your CUI? And they go, I don't know. Well, you don't. You're not doing what you say you do, and that's a very black and white failure.
Yeah, and it absolutely is.
And there's a checkbox against it.
And it goes back to culture, which this whole goes back to having a solid plan at the beginning before you kick everything off.